All right, if I can ask the panelists to unmute themselves, if there are comments or questions that you have for each other before we open it up to attendees, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to speak for a moment to each other if you'd like to.
I can volunteer. That's okay. Um, so I had a question. Uh, I guess more for Andrea than anyone else. Also, hello. So I was really interested in how Ethiopia fits into the world of Byzantine art, in particular because I also get the sense that Byzantium, although I'll say I'm not an art historian, so my knowledge of things is a little shaky, of the secondary scholarship. My sense of the way Byzantium was treated in sort of medieval art was as marginal in itself, and so the idea of Ethiopia as being marginal to that was sort of interesting to me. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on how the approach to Ethiopian art through Byzantium, um, I guess, comes to affect its reception in Western scholarship among those who focus on Western medieval art or Byzantine art history.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good question. I've been thinking about that, especially as a Coptic art historian, because I feel that both Coptic and Ethiopian art are margins of Byzantine art, and then Byzantine is on the margins of the medieval studies. But it's interesting. So the question is, how does it affect Western scholarship? Uh, I mean, I think we're just all trying to find a place, an academic home. And it wasn't in Western medieval art. And so if someone wants to get their PhD in Ethiopian art or Coptic art, the question is like, what institution would they go to? And so the mentors and people who've been supporting that type of work have been Byzantinists because of shared visual languages and the Eastern Christian communities. And so Byzantium is not just Constantinople and Eastern Mediterranean. Like there's post-Byzantine Russian icons that's under the umbrella, and so it's kind of a big umbrella. But yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. Also, there's an issue with Nubian art, medieval Nubian art, because this also kind of falls into the gap and is under the Byzantine umbrella. And for now, it seems like an appropriate place for the academic home. But it'd be great to see more Coptic art historians and Ethiopian art historians and Nubian art historians getting the PhD in African art history. Um, so I think that's something that Kristen and I are kind of trying to work through right now, where the academic homes for these fields should be.
Yes, come join us in African art history. I like it. Something that stood out to me so much in your presentation, and I love your presentation style, by the way, is this idea of agency, the idea of where are Ethiopians looking, and how does that even maybe counter what we are presently trying to do as scholars? Are we maybe trying to fit the history into a mold of our present time too much? And what do you see the challenges of that could be potentially?
I mean, this is like this is a really good question. So this is maybe a naive hope, but like my sort of hope is that as we begin to look at um, the intellectual traditions of Ethiopia, not just among Christian communities, which I'd focused on, but certainly among non-Christian communities as well, is that I kind of hope that it breaks in many ways our sort of chronological and geographic orientations. Um, I, it's sort of difficult for me to get out in a coherent way, but I've sort of always imagined Ethiopia as participating in a kind of, for lack of a better word, uh, like an intellectual zone or network, or at least these ecclesiastical writers that I think the connections within that zone of interaction are far more meaningful than any sort of geographic boundaries or chronological boundaries we could set. And I'd like to see that sort of approach taken not just with the study of Ethiopian history and African history broadly, but I'd also like to see that sort of bleed backwards into Byzantine history and medieval Western European history as well. I don't know if that quite answered the question or made sense, but
Totally did. I love it. Thinking about networks and links more than boundaries.
If I could just follow up on something you said, Felaga, about um, the life of Aragawi and this sense of Christian Ethiopia as being part of the ecumene. I believe that Aragawi starts out by returning to Romia to convert the Romans, the Byzantines. So one of the beautiful things about his life is that the first thing that he does as a good Christian is to go convert those heretics. Well, the ones who have it wrong, right? Which is the Melkite Christians, let's say. And then because he's heard that in Ethiopia they practice well, he goes to Ethiopia and there's nothing to correct because their practice of Christianity is already the way it should be. So like obviously this is a statement done from the point of view of let's say 14th or 15th or 16th century, but it's sort of even wider than Upper Egypt. You know what I mean? Like it's really taking in kind of the whole Mediterranean basin, or let's say the whole Christian ecumene, and the relationship of Ethiopia to these other Christian communities.
Absolutely, and I would just want to add as well that and I'm sure Professor Mary Laura as well probably agrees with this. I suspect in part because she's written this already. But I mean, this bleeds well past the ecclesiastical and into the state politics, and I get the sense that even when presenting claims of legitimacy, domestically, it's always with an eye towards presenting this state as legitimate, sort of in a wider sense. And I think Rome plays a key part in that, sort of presentation of Ethiopia, both on the domestic stage, well, the state at any rate, the Christian state, on a domestic stage and an international stage.
Well, shall we open it up to questions from the attendees? Aaron, do you want to start, or would you like me to start?
Yeah, I could start with one that I think is connected to this to some degree, and it comes from Barbara Cooper, that would perhaps bring art historians into this conversation. And the question is, what are the politics within Ethiopia of identifying its art with one setting versus another? What outsiders think is interesting, but Barbara's curious about whether there's a politics of memory and historical construction that has other drivers, I take it, within Ethiopia itself. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I think I missed it.
Yeah, I think it's directed mainly to the art historian. So if we're thinking about, you drew quite a bit, Felaga, on thinking about how in literature Ethiopians are in this medieval period are drawing connections to the wider world. Barbara's question in some ways looks at the art as well, but maybe from the modern period. But the question is, what are the politics within Ethiopia itself of identifying its art with one setting that is an internal Ethiopian setting versus another setting that might be like a Byzantine setting? So how do Ethiopians, I guess, whether in the medieval period or the modern period, view their art vis-a-vis Africa, vis-a-vis Ethiopia, vis-a-vis the broader Byzantine world?
If I can take a stab at this a little bit, I think a lot of the chronicle of Eos I and Iyasu and how they speak about Menteweb's painting that she commissions in the church at Quizquam. It's a painting that's covered with a real textile. And the authors of the chronicle, this is of course early modern period, moving a little forward, they are so full of pride for Ethiopian art and art coming out of their own kingdom. One of the things that they say explicitly is that this icon is more beautiful than the ones that we get from Egypt or Jerusalem. So thinking about that idea of a self-narration of exceptionalism. And of course, this is a chronicle. This is a hagiographical kind of thing. It's a very praiseworthy kind of thing. But given that we have little contemporaneous writing on art, this particular chronicle gives us very good insight from that moment in the mid 1700s-ish or so.
Perfect. Do you have another question, Samantha?
Yeah, there are actually two that are pretty closely linked from Max McPhee and from Stephen Kaplan, that both have to do about this frame of the medieval and the sort of place of what I might call local religious Ethiopian societies in them. So Max McPhee says, how does defining Ethiopia as Christian and in a medieval frame obscure societies like the Oromo, the kingdom of Kaffa? And Stephen Kaplan follows up on this by saying there are two trends going on in Ethiopian studies in recent decades. One is incorporating Ethiopia in the global medieval, and the other is the incorporation of the histories of previously peripheral Ethiopian peoples into a narrative that was previously kind of dominated by the Christian kingdom. But those seem to negate each other, or the first seems to negate the second. So is there a way of integrating Ethiopia into larger trends in medieval studies without, again, neglecting the non-monotheistic, non-literate peoples of Ethiopia? That's kind of for anyone to take on. But maybe Kristen, since you're dealing with sort of Ethiopia in an African context, it might be particularly relevant.
Absolutely. Though I have to say, my first instinct was to think within the kingdom, and even expanding the narrative very simply to think about the roles of non-Christians in the production of Christian art. I think particularly of the tablet weavings of Gondar, in this sense that you have weavers who are Muslim and Jewish creating art that we would look at as Christian, and thinking about how their sensibilities, their self-perception, their skill, and the idea of who are the artisan classes who are supplying this Christian culture, what are the interrelationships between there. And I don't see necessarily that these two trends are mutually exclusive or that they negate one another. What it does necessitate is making sure that when we bring the story of Ethiopia into this larger study of the global medieval, that we bring the expansion of Ethiopian art history in and of itself into that conversation about the medieval era.
Valiga, were you going to add?
Yes. Sorry, I just want to jump in there as well and say, this is something we lose, right? When we talk about Ethiopia as medieval, we also restrict ourselves to talking about, I mean, with exceptions, right? We can talk about Islam in Ethiopia, but we've transformed this entire region into a group of people who live in the highlands, who are northern, who are Semitic speakers, who adhere to a particular kind of Christianity. And to my mind, that's certainly a kind of great loss. It takes what's happening in one small part of the Horn of Africa, and I mean, sort of tacitly just transposes it on the rest of the region. And so, I mean, this is why in my talk I was very careful about saying that I'm talking about Christians in northern Ethiopia, and in some instances, I'm talking specifically about like a group of ecclesiastical intellectuals. I think I can't speak to art history again, but I think when it comes to the texts, what's going to be lost in this integration is a sense of like how diverse this region is and the different ways in which their interactions generate an expression of Christianity or an expression of Islam or an expression of a kind of Judaism or polytheism or animism that is totally unique to my mind. And so that's I guess a kind of cost to this approach.
And sorry. I just wanted to just jump on that and how it's so important for us to be specific about what we're talking about. And the fact that we say Christians or even Byzantine, because when Kristen and I are talking about Byzantium, we're not only talking about Christian communities, we're also talking about the secular arcs that are coming out of the Byzantine world and the political conversations that are happening that just don't stay within those maps that we're talking about. So it's very important for us to be specific and clear about exactly what we're saying. And we can tell these stories within the framework of global Middle Ages. It doesn't have to be a dichotomy between Christian or Islam or Ethiopia and the West. And we can say that these are the types of narratives that we're privileging for our research right now. But that doesn't say that other narratives shouldn't be researched.
Ray Loud, I think you were going to add also.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think the question of the inclusion of the other societies in the history of medieval Ethiopia is the most important thing we have to think about right now. And the problem is the question of sources for medieval period. Those who don't have any written documentation are very difficult to we have a lot of difficulties just to talk about their history because we don't have so many things. So of course archaeology can give solution, but I'm not sure it's enough. So we have to be very creative and we have to think hard about this to try to change the way we are working on Ethiopian history to be more inclusive. Yes. I think it's one of the big stake for the next years.
I love that idea of being flexible and creative. And certainly in African art, there was a turn starting in the 1980s. And actually, Jan van Sina, who I mentioned, was one of the people behind this in accepting oral history as a valid and legitimate historical source. And I could certainly see that becoming more of a trend within Ethiopian art history, within medieval art history, global Middle Ages, what have you. And it's important to think, you know, what are we even declaring as a legitimate source, so to say, as we create this scholarship? It certainly will require us changing the bounds of that. And while we are so fortunate in Ethiopian art history and politics and literature to have the written word, certainly, you know, that existed alongside the spoken word.
Aaron?
I have a question that might kind of tie into this. It comes at it from the chronological side, and it comes from Tefera Abata, and that is, how are we actually defining the medieval period precisely? That is, what is the analytical relevance of this periodization for understanding Ethiopia? And I bring it in here because it's been lurking beneath the surface, but of course this chronological period is either from the Christian kingdoms of Ethiopia or the broader Byzantine framework. So what exactly are we saying chronologically? What is this? What is the precise medieval period? And what does it add or take away? What's the heuristic value of this? That's for anyone and everyone.
Marie-Laure, go ahead.
I guess I answered this question for my part, and I don't think considering that the period from the 7th century to the 15th end of the 15th century is only a periodization from the Christian point of view. In fact, it includes also all what is happening in the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea region, and this is not depending on the Christian world. It depends on the development of the Muslim world, which is in fact the most important motor in this engine, in this area. And of course, we have to take into consideration those societies which are not in this main history of the monotheistic religion. But if we consider that all these societies which are also living with these people becoming Christian, becoming Muslim, in a way, they are depending also on this periodization. So of course we can always criticize periodization, but I think medieval period from the 7th to the 15th, end of the 15th century works in a way.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I would just weigh in from a perspective of a curator who works in a medieval art department. And I know the word medieval sometimes it means middle, right? So the after antiquity and before the Renaissance, but also people know what the time and space is as well. And so if we're bringing our field to a general audience, right, or thinking about pipelines and trying to get people into the field, but a lot of people don't know what the term 5th century to 15th century actually means. Like a high schooler might not know what that means, but they have a sense of what medieval means. And so, you know, we have to be careful as scholars not to make our research so esoteric that we aren't bringing people in. And so we have, I mean, that's just as my perspective as a curator who thinks about broad audiences.
Anyone else want to jump in? Or I have another question if people are interested. Yeah. This question's been asked a couple of different ways, and it's for all of the panelists. I'll just read a couple of different versions of it. But one is, what advice would you give for a Western medievalist or Byzantine scholar interested in working with or incorporating Ethiopian material so as to engage meaningfully the nuances of the particular region? This is referring to Professor Durat's talk. And just a different version of a similar question. Just a second, my slide has moved. What are the biggest conceptual theoretical challenges for scholars of the European medieval ages who want to incorporate Ethiopia into our consideration of the global Middle Ages?
Is it all right if I give this? Okay, so I guess the question that I noticed in the chat was from Brandon Hawk, which was the what are the biggest conceptual or theoretical challenges? I'll say, and just for myself, so I may be, you know, like outing myself a little bit, but for me, like what shocked me initially getting into this was, I mean, from a certain standpoint, like how broken the infrastructure is for studying Ethiopian history and for studying Ge'ez. It's like incredibly difficult. The best dictionary is produced in Latin. So there's like a whole other linguistic barrier to taking up the Ge'ez language. And it's more those problems that I encountered rather than any theoretical or conceptual challenges. And that's why I say for people who are interested, I mean, from a textual standpoint, people who are interested in integrating, for example, if you worked on early Byzantine history and you wanted to integrate Aksumite history, I could point you to resources. The question is, like, can you get access to the RIE? That's a sort of, at least in my experience, it's been a sort of difficult text to get. The way I ended up acquiring it when I was working in grad school was I had to like take a bus to the epigraphy center near the ag campus, which was a whole 15-minute journey and like request I mean, a whole nightmare. And so that I think is the biggest challenge, that like a lot of the basic tools for studying Ge'ez and for studying Ethiopian history are missing. And that's sort of my contribution here. I hope I didn't, you know, reveal myself as ignorant.
Just to add, I think that's incredibly important. It's one thing to talk about the theoretical limitations, it's another to talk about the real barriers, and that's something we should address.
But just kind of going on that point, I don't think it's only focusing on Ethiopian art. I think it's even medieval art. Like, how does one get into medieval art? You need Latin or Greek if you want to study Byzantium, and so we have to think about what types of barriers are put up within our field to even get into it, even to study the global Middle Ages. So, you know, it's difficult to study Coptic art or Ethiopian art and Nubian art, but it's also difficult for people to even get into the fields. And so I think this is a broader conversation for academia in order to become more inclusive.
This has certainly been one of the silver linings of the pandemic. Finding a course in Amharic, Ingez, any of these languages is near impossible in the United States and usually involves travel or tuition that is out of reach for many, whether they're young students or professionals who are rooted in one place because of their job. And certainly, the opportunity to take classes remotely is one that should be encouraged even as we go back into our in-person world, because the level of access is phenomenal. And it also changes the game in terms of universities. No longer do they have to say, oh, we don't have enough students to offer this. And this is something I've been increasingly seeing too, outside of focuses on the Horn of Africa. For example, Yoruba courses that are split between Columbia and Cornell, where one half of the group is in person, the other is beaming in via Zoom or something similar. These kind of willingness to go beyond the typical bounds of what a language classroom looks like or language study looks like can only help us in bringing more people into the field and really properly equipping scholars.
If I could follow up a little bit as someone who's been active in these online GES classes, I do have one fear in all of this, and that is that it leads to a reduction in the number of universities and places that are actually teaching GES. So I had this problem with my own work, being asked to do an online class, say in Syriac or GES for several different universities who practically it means that the administration cannot fund GES or Syriac at that university. So it is a balance. I agree that it's great to open it up, but there is this balance that at the end of the day, we have to have some positions for people to teach these languages. So that's something to kind of, attention. Thank you.
I might just jump in there in terms of conceptual challenges as a Europeanist, as someone who is trained as a Europeanist. One of the real challenges for me in starting to study Ethiopian material about 9 years ago is false friends. So something that looks similar, and in fact, in many ways is similar, but it's not exactly the same. And I think it can be easy to trip up there. And for me, at least, to just always like try and really pay attention to not assuming that I know what monasticism is, right? Or how it works. Or, if I find a reference to the Athanasian Creed, right? Is that really the Athanasian Creed that I think it is? Or is it something else? Like just constantly having to check up on things that sound familiar. Because the common roots in early Christianity, but then the different development and the unique development of traditions in Ethiopia means that things that I might at first glance think that I recognize or understand are things that I don't. And that whose sort of unique instantiation in Ethiopia I need to learn more about.
No, I think a lot about that from an art historical perspective as well, because things that look similar, but they mean different things in the context. And the question and answer, people have asked about the influences. And I didn't say that Byzantine art influenced Ethiopian art. It was just the way that it was received during a scholarship starting in the 1890s. And I think that this is something that Kristen and I are trying to reevaluate and look at. Like, what is Byzantine, possibly in terms of iconography and motifs, and Ethiopian art, but then what's Ethiopian and Byzantine art? What's African and Byzantine art? Like, we're thinking about cross-directional pathways, and maybe there's nothing there, but we're just bringing these questions up because they really haven't been fleshed out in a way that shows exchange and communication as not just north going down to south.
Absolutely. And just looking at what someone's written in the chat about the bounds of what we even call Ethiopia, of course, there's always such a challenge in using contemporary national boundaries for talking about the deeper historical past. And certainly, we may be better nuanced if we say Ethio-Eritrean region, historical Ethiopia.